The unknown story of Latin America's longest reigning president, the most violent human rights issue that no one knows about. In 1912, a baby destined for 3 decades of power was born, and his name was Alfredo Sauce.
His name was Alfredo Stroessner.
Never mind, his name is Alfredo Stroessner.
He was born from a German immigrant and a Paraguayan woman. Alfredo Stroessner joined the army in 1928 when he was 16, and he rose to the top, becoming the commander-in-chief.
He got into power by overthrowing the government before him. On May 4th, 1954, he led a coup against President Federico Chavez that would change Paraguay forever.
Since Alfredo Stroessner was the commander-in-chief, he had the support of the army since he proved himself in many wars, especially the Chaco War.
At about 8 o'clock p.m. on May 4th, 1954, the Paraguayan Army's elite battalion of 40, led by Mario Ortega, attacked. It was a small but an important battle. It was to begin one of the longest reigns in Latin American history.
Alfredo Stroessner also, surprisingly, had the support of the USA. This was during the Cold War, and Alfredo Stroessner claimed to be against communism, gaining U.S. support.
Actually, foreign intervention was very prominent when Stroessner was in power, but not in the way that you think. There was a big plan between Argentina, Chile, Uruguay, Brazil, Paraguay, Bolivia, and the U.S. They came together to create the Condor plan. The plan let them exchange information, and the goal was to repress opposition to the current leadership and therefore stop communism.
But that is just the beginning of his dark story. The people feared him in his authoritarian rule. Alfredo Stroessner ruled with an iron fist for 35 years and had no regard for constitutional rights.
He used his authority to stay in power using the army and purged anyone in his party who was against him. He also allowed the country to be a refuge that housed war criminals, such as Nazis. During his regime, 19,862 people were arrested, 18,772 people were tortured, 236 minors were deprived of liberty, 17 children were born in prison, 20,814 politicians were exiled, 459 forced disappearances, 128,076 indirect and direct victims were reported only in Paraguay, and not including Plan Condor.
Paraguay at the time was going through a socio-economic crisis, and Stroessner implemented the General Development Plan. This plan created many organizations for Paraguay, La Representa de Itapu, and created better road systems, new schools, universities, hospitals, buildings, and new towns that helped build the economy. It attracted sympathizers and solved problems of the water and electricity. Stroessner's regime is actually really interesting because he did so many bad things, and yet he also did these amazing things. But the good things that he did was also flawed. He cut costs and put weird study techniques and inefficient protocol. This way, he saved money, controlled people, and kept the popular vote in the elections that he had only to keep the U.S. happy, when he was only really running against himself. Yet Paraguay wouldn't have been as far as it is without him.
And his story is just starting. When Stroessner had ruled for a few years, he wanted to colonize rural areas of Paraguay. There was only one little problem. These rural areas were owned by the indigenous people. He tried to colonize by selling the land from under the natives' feet, basically trying to make them disappear. There was already land scarcity, and this made the unequal land distribution even worse. But that's not it. Stroessner not only wanted to sell their land, he also wanted to convert them to Christianity. Of course, that was until the 1960s when the Second Vatican Council and Medellin Conference took place. During these meetings, the Church adopted a new stance stating they would no longer support dictators abusing human rights by forcing conversions. Since so many people were being affected by Stroessner trying to take land, they all joined together to stop this injustice. Labor unions, church-based communities, campesino organizations, and even Catholic school children. In the November of 1978, 10,000 people signed a petition urging the government to give land to the Inuit tribe.
The people were very upset that their rights were being violated. Many revolts broke out and organizations began to form. It was the people and church versus Stroessner. The government then exiled Jesuit priests and stopped supporting Christianity. They became very violent and even killed priests that were peacefully protesting. The government cut them out. They also imprisoned and tortured the Indigenous secretary, Gloria Estrigo. They were torturing protesters, even the women. Many organizations were formed to protest against Stroessner. One of the most ambitious non-governmental organization groups was formed by the Catholic University in favor of the rights of the Indigenous people. This group was called the Maradu Project. This organization informed the Indigenous people of their rights. They raised awareness about genocide and it embarrassed Stroessner's regime.
In response, the Stroessner's Minister of Defense, Marcial Samaniego, made everyone in the government sign something to show the public that the genocide was not true. Because of the forced signing, the church threatened to cite the case as a human rights violation and finally forced the regime to give over the territory in November 1979. Finally, in 1981, the regime promised they would entitle the natives to their land by the end of the year. When the time finally came, everyone rushed in, cutting trees and settling. The foreign human rights agencies allied with the people, and they forced the government to sell thousands of hectare-acres of land to the indigenous communities.
When they opened the gates, people rushed in to claim the land. However, later on, they were moved to an unpleasant land, and the area had no fertile soil, which meant the indigenous people could not have any successful crops. This whole mess did not only affect the indigenous people, but it also affected the entire country. At this point, people were tired of corruption, repression, and worsening economy, and the entire nation started to tear the regime at its seams throughout the year.
When you think about how indigenous populations affected Paraguay, you think of back before Paraguay was colonized by Spain, which is very important. Paraguay was Spain's second most important colony after all, until it quickly lost that title and invaded a lot of slavery. But you never realize how important they are in more recent times, like Stroessner's rule. I mean, they single-handedly exposed his entire regime to the nation. And sure, there were other reasons, but they played a huge part in taking down Stroessner's regime, which fell in January 1989.
And the ripples of his rule permeate to the present and future of Paraguay. His reign brought many good and bad things affecting generations of people after. As for what is in the future, who knows? We can only reflect on the past and act in the present.